Okay, I would like to call the Amberley Village Council meeting of November 30th, 2020 to order. Please call the roll.
Mayor Muthing,
Here.
Natalie Wolf,
Here.
Richard Bardak. You're up. You're muted.
Here.
Peg Conway,
Here.
Ed Hattenbach,
Here.
Elita Kamine,
Here.
Ray Warren,
Here.
Scott Larmer,
Present.
Wes Brown,
Here.
Brian Snyder.
Brian's me. Here.
There it is.
Okay, so just before we do the Pledge of Allegiance, just so everyone, we are recording this meeting, so it will be available to residents to view online, and it was posted, so they obviously there are a number of residents that are online with us. Once we start the meeting, and I think Scott will be going through a lot of the material with us. And so the way I would propose to run this meeting is, since our previous work sessions, we've been in person, this is our first Zoom work session. The way I would propose to do it is we'll allow Scott to go through the material. Tammy will man the controls. And if council members could use the raise your hand feature. And then once Scott completes his presentation, if council members, as he goes through it, could record any, on their paper, record any questions that they're going to have for Scott. And so we'll go through each little session and then we'll have a discussion about it. Is that okay with all council members?
It's fine. I just don't have I don't see a raise your hand option. I mean, I could use a chat to send a note to you.
Amy, where's the raise your hand?
Ray, if you click on participants.
Yeah.
And you'll see the list of all the participants over there on your screen, probably on the right. And look down at the bottom, there's a bunch of options, and on the left it says raise hand. Then you can.
I see, got it. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So if everyone could please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. And again, we won't rise for this. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the
of the United States of America
and to
and
the
to the
republic
republic for which it stands, one nation, under
under
God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. And again, it definitely makes the most sense to do this work session via Zoom. But, we're going to have to be patient working through this. It is obviously very important that we try to work through this. And if we can't get through it all today, then we may need to do it again. But we need to work our way through this the best we can. So I will turn it over to Scott.
Okay, thank you. I'll limit my presentation to 3 hours, so that there's plenty of time for council to chat. I'm pretty much going to go through this per the agenda. So I broke it down on the agenda how we were going to discuss it. So the first thing I want to focus on is what outreach has been done in order to get this information out to residents. So, and this was included in your packet, but I just want to go over a few of these items so we can reiterate some of these points. Public hearings were held at the Planning Commission level as well as Village Council. Planning Commission held 2 public hearings. Council held 4 public hearings. So we've done the Planning Commission or the planning hearing piece of it and have done that extensively. This was something that we felt was important early on, and you will recall we've been talking about this for nearly a year, but we did send a postcard out that was sent to every address in the village. So we made it known that way. It was also included in the spring print newsletter. So the print newsletter goes to every mailbox in the village. So it was the front page story on the spring print newsletter. It was also part of a story in the fall print newsletter. So we've hit both spring as well as fall in terms of the timing of those publications that hit every household. And then in addition to that, in e-news, which is a monthly publication, it has hit in quite a few of the e-news, giving updates on it since about May of 2020, so the last 7 months. And then it has been an item on our website, so it's been included there. And then there were 3 videos that were prepared by staff in order to communicate what does this zoning mean and what's being proposed and what's it look like and things of that nature. So all of that consists of our public outreach. I just want to share a few numbers with you. So with all those categories that I just listed, with the mailings, the notices, and the e-news, and the number of views that we see on that, if you look at all of those, we're up to 17,000 estimated views. So it's been going on for quite some time. So there's been quite a bit of effort to make sure that the public knows what it is that we're doing. The second category is on the Planning Commission recommendations, because this particular ordinance does require Planning Commission to weigh in on.
Can I stop you on that? I just want to make sure. Tammy, did anybody have a raised hand?
No one has a raised hand at this moment.
Okay. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
So Planning Commission's role here is anytime that zoning is going to be created, zoning code, or if there's going to be a modification to the code, or there's going to be some type of item related to zoning, then Planning Commission, it's incumbent on them to take this and hold a public hearing and have dialogue among themselves on this particular topic. So Planning Commission, as I mentioned, had 2 public hearings. They had the item was referred to them as what you folks worked with Brian Snyder on in your work sessions. And Brian is with us today, so he'll be able to answer any questions that you might have about the text as well. But the Planning Commission held these 2 hearings, and we did have about 4 or 5 residents that attended those meetings and offered testimony. Planning Commission took a little different take on this, and they certainly are entitled to weigh in on it because that's what we were asking them to do. But the approach that they took was a little different because they did not believe that the village should move forward with all of the requirements within the zoning text. They were okay with the uses, and you recall that the principal permitted uses, the council spent a significant amount of time talking about the various uses. They did not have issues with those. The areas where the Planning Commission expressed concern was, one, in regards to retail. What you had proposed in the zoning code text was to limit to a 20% retail. We were not intending for the retail to be standalone. We felt like 20% should be the max. And so tying that in such a way, Planning Commission felt like that was too restrictive. The other area that Planning Commission expressed some concerns about was having any conditions beyond the uses. So this was a little odd because normally in a zoning code, you'd be able to see what the minimum acreage is or what the setbacks are or other requirements that would occur. We have that in all of our zoning codes. Planning Commission's take on this was that they felt like we should be just allowing people to come in and be creative. And so they did not want to restrict anybody. From a planning standpoint, that is problematic for us because not having any kind of guidelines or any rules or any minimums, then it's up to council as well as Planning Commission to sort of make the rules up as you go along. And that typically leads to inconsistencies and can create issues pretty frequent and also down the road. And one of the concerns I had is even if we did not put those types of restrictions in, the limitations in, Once you get into a second or a third user of a particular property on Amberley Green, that's when you're really going to have problems. When you're trying to establish something that somebody is already there, then they have already been grandfathered, so to speak. So, but that was part of what Planning Commission had, that's where it's sort of where they landed on that. Some of the other things that the Planning Commission mentioned is that they were concerned about developers having to seek variances. Now, in this zoning code, as you know, since you've worked on it extensively, there is a lot to this zoning text. And it's intentional because I think all of us are trying to be very intentional with the Amberley Green zoning text, because we are wanting to be as specific as possible. And we want to make sure that what happens there is going to be looked at by Planning Commission as well as council. And so I think for good measure, we have a lot of what some people may call as language in there that's maybe cumbersome or bureaucratic, but I do believe that was intentional on our part. But it's not uncommon, and it's actually mentions in this code that we expect variances to be sought. I don't think you can expect a developer, if they're wanting to look at one particular piece of Amberley Green, that they will be able to meet all parts of the zoning code that's being discussed tonight. That is typically not common for that to happen. So actually variances are allowed in this zoning code and certainly expected. So we don't believe that this zoning code is going to be a deterrent to any kind of a serious developer, because they are going to need to seek some type of variances here. So after Planning Commission made their recommendation, and it was a 3-to-1 vote, there were only 4 members at the meeting, staff took those recommendations and incorporated those into the write-up for Village Council. So when you held your public hearings, you could see what Planning Commission said and also the testimony from any residents that appeared in those meetings. But from a staff standpoint, the intent was to move forward with a zoning code text for Amberley Green. And when I looked at it, and when Brian Snyder looked at it, when Wes Brown looked at it, we all came to the same conclusions, that you have to have minimum standards. You have to call out certain things in the zoning code. If not, it's going to be a reckless process. So Planning Commission is a recommending body, and that's all it is. So they did what we asked them to do. And so you can take that for what it's worth. It's coming from your Planning Commission, and they are used to looking at items, but that was their take on the zoning code text. I would also add that Planning Commission was not part of this process to create the zoning code text. You worked with Brian Snyder and with staff during the work sessions that we held in the community room. And so you all understand what the origins of that Amberley Green zoning text was, where it originated from, the concerns that you had, and the areas that you were trying to protect. And so from a staff perspective, I think all of those have been captured quite well within this particular zoning text. Now, that does not mean that the text is perfect. By no means would I go that far, but it certainly is what we need in order to get moving on any kind of development for Amberley Green, because recall that the current zoning on the property is single family residential. And I don't hear anybody coming forward and saying they want to see single family residential on Amberley Green. So that covers my Planning Commission comments. Any raised hands?
I've got,
You're muting.
yeah, Scott, when you talked about the expectation for variances and so forth, and we've kind of talked this about a little bit, but, and maybe Brian can answer this or whatever, but the amount of variances that we would expect to see in this case versus say a PUD, is it similar? I mean, we can't do a PUD because we don't have that, but is the process similar as far as the number of questions or potential variances we would expect?
Yeah. Brian, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Yeah, so this is the way what we started out with was creating a PUD district, and it has evolved into this district. So this is essentially a PUD just for Amberley Green. When you have a district such as this and you build in flexibility in the zoning in exchange for getting what you want on the property, you expect to have some give and take, and there's an ability for the Planning Commission to make recommendations for relaxing the standards or granting variances, and then as council, you have the authority to either grant or not grant any requested modifications or variances to the text of the code when you approve the zone change.
But that would be the, I mean, if we were able to do a PUD, it would be, we would have expected a similar type of back and forth.
Well,
correct?
Yes, that's correct. The number of potential variances goes up the more regulations you include. So if the Planning Commission recommending no regulations at all, there would have been no variances because there were no regulations. So if you want to have some standards that kind of guide, just the basics of what you want, there is going to be the potential for more variances in that case.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to move to the next category, which is the resident feedback. So included in your packet was the information in regards to resident feedback. So this is categorized into two different areas. And I can share my screen if you would like, but I believe that you've seen all of this. But the way that we categorized it was the public hearing testimony. So the public hearing both at the Planning Commission level as well as Village Council. And so what Tammy was able to do was to capture the minutes from Planning Commission where resident testimony was given, and then the same aspect with the council, with the different meetings that you held. So she's captured the various residents that spoke in regards to the AGD, the ordinance 2020-16. And then the second category is that area where residents made comments in regards to the Amberley Green zoning text. And so this was a more, there were more comments here. It's a heavier document in the sense that residents were able to email comments to us, and we did receive some of those. Some came through the eGov system. Some folks who responded put attachments to it, referencing some materials that they believe should be taken into consideration, like the long-range plan recommendations, some of the work that we had previously done a few years ago with when we were seeking developers for Amberley Green. But all of those written comments have been included in your packet as well. So that concludes my resident feedback portion of it. Any questions from that? Okay, I'm going to go to the next section, which is Amberley Green, what I'm calling Amberley Green Conservation Development Study. So one thing that you expressed back in, I believe it was actually in December of 2019, as we were working on the zoning code text, was you were looking for something that would outline where the undevelopable areas would be. And I know you have seen that because when MKSK did the study in 2017, 2018, they did a slope analysis that identified specifically where the slopes were so steep that there would not be the ability to do development. You could do development, but it was going to be problematic. And so typically when slopes are so steep, you typically stay away from them because it can be loaded with some issues. But when we looked at that, that gave us some information, but I thought that we could probably go one or two steps further. So what I did is I asked MKSK, which is the folks that did the study a few years ago, to take a couple of looks at the slope study and bring it forward to us in the sense that identify those areas that would not be developable. And so that is what they have done. So the last attachment that was in your packet is something that the Public Buildings and Parks Committee reviewed last week. And I think everybody, maybe except for Councilmember Bardak, was in that meeting. So you probably heard that. So I'm not going to go through that entire report, but I do want to summarize what was asked of MKSK and then just briefly talk about what that end product is. So our jumping off point was really the slope study. We had that in hand from the previous analysis. So I wanted MKSK, to identify the preservation of tree areas. We all know that one thing that stands out with Amberley Green would be the trees on the property. And so preserving some of those trees, because we have stated that we want to make sure that not all, but a lot of the trees on the property get preserved. And typically when you talk about tree preservation, you start talking about clusters. You don't talk about individual trees unless it is something really special. So that was one of the areas that they were asked to look at. The other thing that we always talk about with Amberley Green is the views. And we've always said that the views up there are just spectacular. And so protecting some of those views was something that I felt like was important to council. And so MKSK took a look at that, and they ended up identifying at least 3 areas on the property where they felt like the views should be protected. And when I say protected, that means that there should not be a building that blocks the view. So for example, we're all familiar with looking out towards the west over the community garden and looking at Western Cincinnati. You would probably not be happy if there was a building that was blocking that view. And so that was one of them that they had identified. So that was one thing that they were tasked to do. Another item that they were asked to focus on was the cart paths, the former cart paths on the property. As you know, the former cart paths are a signature piece on that property because so many people walk there, and it really has become a higher traffic area for a variety of uses. And residents, as we've spoken to residents, I think most of us have made the comment that there's an expectation that residents will continue to be able to use the property even amongst development that occurs on that property. So let's say that there is an office condo development that happens on the property, or if there is some other kind of a splash pool or something put in, residents still are going to have access to most of the property. And that's typically going to be via the former walking paths. So that was another piece that they highlighted. The other part of it is in what you're looking at tonight is there is a section in there. It's a perimeter of Amberley Green to protect the borders. So MKSK picked up on that and then applied the 50-foot, which is what is in the proposed zoning text, and applied that around the entire perimeter of the property except for the western side. So it captures both on all 3 sides except the west. And then the last item is to move that into an area where you see what the available uses are, the developable areas are, and then the undevelopable areas. So being able to contrast that. And what you'll see here in a minute is that it's about a 50% split when it's all said and done. Now, one other aspect of MKSK that I did ask them to do was to just give us an idea of what types of uses could be proposed in those undevelopable areas. Sometimes slopes are good for other uses that maybe you don't think of. And there may be some areas that are undeveloped that you want to preserve, or maybe you want to call it out for something. And so they did just generate a few ideas for that, but it certainly was not intended to be comprehensive, and it was merely just to get the ball rolling in terms of ideas. So now I'd like to share my screen so we can just walk through briefly that MKSK study, since most of you have seen it, and I'll just briefly capitalize on some of the things that they highlight. Oops. All right, bear with me here. Are you able to see this?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So the first few slides in their presentation was information that they had gathered from the previous work that had been done. Here's the slope analysis, just showing that those areas that are in red typically are areas that you stay away from. And then this is a result of what we looked at from a year and a half, 2 years ago, is that 44 acres were considered undevelopable, and then an 88 acres are developable. So starting that as the jumping off point, they then identified the slopes. So that area in red would be the slope areas. Then they identified environmentally sensitive areas. So this would be areas where there could be a water feature, such as the 2 or 3 ponds that are on the property. If there were some dense tree areas like clusters, what they identify as clusters, or some prairies or anything that was notable from an environmental standpoint. So they sort of added on to the initial slope study and added these as areas that could be set aside as undevelopable. And then as I referenced about some of the view sheds, what we call view sheds, these are the 3 that they've identified. The one most notable to us is the one over near the community garden, just west of the former clubhouse. The other one is over off of Galbraith Road, sort of in the middle of the property, looking towards the west. And then the one at the intersection of Galbraith Road and Ridge is an area that I think all of us look into, and that's what we see as we enter Amberley Green. That's the sort of the first visual that we find there. So they identified these 3 view sheds that should be protected in some way. And then this is the path that we talked about earlier. So what MKSK was referencing was most likely there would be a perimeter path around the property so that somebody could walk the entire property. But then we expect that there'll be some connecting paths. Right now there are, but if there's some development in some of those areas where where development could be, it may be some paths need to be relocated, or maybe some paths have to go away and some other paths have to be established. But the intent would be that there would still be access from a path standpoint on the property. This is the 50-foot buffer that got included for the east, north, and south boundaries of Amberley Green. So it's 50 foot. So it equates to a couple of acres when you take that 50 foot and apply it. So we're just sort of adding layers to the amount of undevelopable land that is going to exist at Amberley Village or Amberley Green. So this is really the contrast between developable and undevelopable. So MKSK is showing about in the gold and the, I think they call it the orange here, areas that are developable. So pod A, pod B, C, D, and E consist of about 69 acres, okay? So that gives you a good sense as to where the developable land is. And this is not cast in stone, but it's just a sort of a snapshot when you build on what, on the study that they were working on. This sort of shows it as more of a contrast. So here you're seeing the conservation, the open space areas, at least what they considered open space and conservation areas, about 63 acres. So I referenced earlier, it's about a 50-50 split for the property. And then this is the last piece of it where they've identified where the paths are on the property and identified that perhaps there could be some areas like pollinator garden and orchard, and some of those areas where perhaps now it's not an area that can be developed, but maybe there could be some uses that would be applicable and educational for our residents. So they've listed some of those. And then they concluded with some signage and some education if you want to do some of that kind of stuff on the property. For example, they noted plant identification. We have some very interesting trees on that property. I think we all look at trees, but a lot of us don't know what the differences are between trees. So this could be an opportunity to do something like that. And then the last piece of it was the playground. They felt like there ought to be a playground on the property somewhere. They're not saying where, but they're just saying that this is likely going to be in an area that is a developable area, but that also depends on what happens with the property. But I think we've all had a sense that there would be a playground on this property at some point. And the last page here is just some of those other uses that that could be proposed. Now, when we had the Public Buildings and Parks Committee, there were a couple of suggestions here. One was to incorporate the connectivity study that MKSK did along with CT Consultants a couple of years ago. You recall that getting connectivity over primarily on the south and on the west side would allow more residents to be able to access this from a pedestrian standpoint, not vehicular. So it was suggested that that be incorporated in here, and that can easily be done. And then the other piece of it was, while these are just some pictures of different aspects of use on the property, I think our expectations are there'll be some type of common space, common ground or place where there could be a gathering point. And so that can be incorporated into this as well. So that really is a synopsis of the MKSK study. And so where that leads from here is we tried to identify ways that it could be incorporated as part of, from a contextual standpoint, where we move forward, if that is something that council wants to make sure is part of the Amberley Green zoning text. So one of the suggestions was that you could adopt it as a plan, and we would probably want to make some modifications to create it as a plan. For right now, it really is more of a study, but we can certainly turn that into a plan. We could certainly have it recorded at the county, do something so that if somebody did a property search on this, they would find that this particular item was deeded and was shown as an item. It was also suggested during our Public Buildings and Parks Committee meeting to perhaps reference it as an appendix to the Amberley Green zoning text, and that's probably a very good option as well. The final option would be to do like a conservation easement. Conservation easements are typically permanent. They're very difficult to change, and they can be problematic because if you, let's say that you wanted to do some kind of a development on a piece of the property, and if it encroached upon the conservation area, it would hinder what you wanted to do. So typically conservation easements are only if you absolutely know it's going to be a wetlands or it's not going to ever be used for any kind of purpose. So I would not recommend the conservation easement route. So that sort of concludes the MKSK Conservation and Development Study. And so the only thing I really haven't talked about is the actual zoning text, but I think you've heard.
Before you move
John
on,
Natalie
I
has a
had
question.
hand up.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I had my hand raised before you move on to the next part.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just make sure, or just emphasize, I guess, that the words development and undevelopable and uses, we're using them really quite loosely. And as the MKSK study points out, there are a lot of uses that we might enjoy that would be done on the undevelopable part of the land. The arboretum, the garden, the exercise equipment, those kind of things. And when we talk about whether something is undevelopable, we're really talking about, like building something there, either residential, commercial, or industrial. But, like the other things are uses that would go on the undevelopable areas.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. I just wanted it to be clear to whoever is watching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good point. Other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So early on, when you're talking about the zoning commission and their comments, I don't seem to recall. Did we ever? I know in one area and specifically, you had to do with the limitation of 20% retail space, and the planning commission voted to eliminate that limitation. I don't recall if did that come to council, or is that something we may want to act on, or what's the status of that request?
Are we going to go back to the beginning of the agenda? Like, was this just a report? Are we going to go through each of those?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just wait then.
Okay. All right, so the only thing I have not talked about is the actual Amberley Green zoning text itself. And I know that we've been working on it for a year and that we've had a lot of discussion about it and we've answered questions on it. I can go through that, but I don't want to I don't want to drag you through it if you're very familiar with it, which I think that you all are. So I'll hesitate there to get some direction from council if you want me to walk you through the zoning text. Okay. All right. So then that concludes what I have to say. So now we can go step by step if you'd like.
So in going step by step, or, you know, I don't know if it makes the most sense to go back through what you just did, or for council members to individually talk about, you know, possible things that they want to consider changing or whatever. To me, it makes more sense to kind of have each council member one by one kind of bring up issues that they think need to be worked in the work session.
Okay. All right.
So I guess the easiest thing would be to go in alphabetical order. So Peg, do you want to make comments?
Rich is before me.
Oh, thank you. Rich, you want to go? You have to, there you go.
I don't have any comments right now.
Okay. Peg?
Okay. I appreciate the way this was all laid out. I particularly appreciate being reminded of all the communication that was done. Like, I knew all that, but to have it kind of listed. So I guess in terms of the communication, the question one of the questions I'm reflecting on is, have we done enough? Do we have enough input? And I think I'm coming out that yes, we do. We have for a very long time, in a sustained manner in multimedia, we have conveyed information to the public, and we have heard from some people with very strong feelings, and we've heard from a few others on other matters. I also historically have had a lot of faith in the Amberley citizens, who are, I believe, by and large, very engaged and informed and not hesitant to express their opinion. So in terms, and then moving on to the Planning Commission, I'm open to discussion among the group. I'd like to hear some discussion among the group around the retail piece. I seem to recall we had a reason why we did it that way. I know it had to do with the future uses and things. I do not favor the open and what they perceived as open and creative approach. I think we need to put out there in the world what it is we're looking for to some degree. And I think that I think that's what developers are used to. I don't think what we're doing here is that unusual. So from that standpoint, I would like to hear from others around their statements, but in general, I would favor leaving our ordinance mostly as it is. There was a question, I had a question in reading the resident feedback. The gentleman who lives across Galbraith and asked that we adopt some recommendations from the engineers. I don't know what that, I mean, that's very, very particular. It doesn't really affect the zoning, I don't think, but that was a question I had from reading that. And I'm really excited about the conservation study. We had we already covered that a bit in the Public Buildings and Parks Committee, but I'm really interested also in understanding preserving green space beyond the undevelopable areas, if that is the will and desire of some group of citizens or any entity that would want to do that, and how that would come about, in that if any more needs to be provided, any mechanisms need to be provided beyond the zoning in order for that to happen, and to be aware of how it could happen, just generically. And I think that concludes my statements.
So Peg, just so we can come back to it, the two main things I heard that I want to talk about more later is the 20% allowance for retail that the planning commission brought up. And then also the conservation study and ways to incorporate that into the document and green space, et cetera. Is that?
And to extend how, if and how that could be extended if there is at any time a desire to designate green space, even in the developable area.
Okay. All right, Ed? Ed, you're muted.
The overlay from MKSK, which we got last week, helped a lot in the visualization of this, how the property can be used. But in order to get more, shall we say, acceptance from from the residents, to be able to present them with some model or some schematic of where the structures or how the buildings, the residences, the playgrounds, where that will be conceivably on the property, as well as roads and parking. Because I think people really would like to see how we can maximize the utilization and satisfy all of our needs. Is that is that a possible attainable project, shall we say?
Well, I guess, and I'll let Scott and Brian possibly talk about it. I mean, that to me is something outside your traditional zoning.
I don't think it's outside the zoning, but it adds to how we will utilize all the land which can be used in its various features.
No, but I mean, potentially as far as location of roads and so forth, that would typically come in, you have a developer saying, all right, now I see what you're zoning, my proposal is to do this, and here's where I would put the roads, et cetera. And so that is the discussion that you would have, after the zoning is in place. But I leave that to Scott, people much more knowledgeable than me, like.
I mean, the professional developers would know better than we.
Let me just give you my perspective on it. I think what's happening in this process is that we're getting away from what the basic is, which is creating some zoning for the property. And I'll go back to my comment that right now it's only zoned for residential. So if the residential developer came in today, they could develop the property, and that's not what we want. So what is it that we want? And so the zoning code that is being proposed, but enables those other uses. And so you need to stay focused that you need to get that zoning text in place. If there are other things that you want to do on the property or other areas you want to pursue, that's really outside of the zoning. Zoning is not going to take in, zoning text is not going to take into consideration any kind of utilities, any kind of roadway, or any kind of other type of uses on the property. It's just going to stipulate the types of uses that are permitted on the property and what the standards are if somebody wants to do anything on that property. So Brian, do you have anything to add on that?
No, that's pretty, you guys have summed it up pretty well.
Thank you.
Okay, Elita.
Thank you. So I'll try to do it in the order I like. Peg's organized it well, and I'll try to follow that order as well. I will say, I agree, I concur that the communication has been very thorough. Unfortunately, with that said, believe it or not, I'm still talking to people who ask me every day, what's going on with the J? What's happening up there? And just have no idea what's going on. So that's fine. And I don't think that's a gating issue for this, but I do think that it directly speaks to, it's hard for people to care about zoning in the hypothetical, and even, kind of concurring with the point Ed just made, it's still hard for people land use is not the sexiest topic, even as we make it. Scott, you've done yeoman's work on that, but as we get into specific proposals and things, this is still our community property. The goal is not to hand it over to developers. I've been very wary of anything in this that telegraphs development community, come in and give us everything. We're ready to turn this whole puppy over to you to take over our process. And so I say that to register vehemently my like dislike for the Planning Commission trying to remove a public process by removing a public process from this, by saying we're good to go, this is good enough, whatever they come up with. And I specifically was very compelled, Scott, by your comment, which I think I had brought up on other in previous work sessions about, and then the secondary and the tertiary and what happens in 100 years. You know, we only get one. This is our one shot, really, to some extent. And of course, you know how I feel about ownership as well. But so I think I just want to register my I do not support those two pieces specific to the Planning Commission piece. I think otherwise, my biggest concern as it specifically relates to this is something you've heard me say before, and it actually relates pretty much directly to sort of what Peg and Ed both said, but in different ways, which is I am concerned about how we pass this without a process for how we designate the community spaces, which are to me the most critical piece of this. The community uses, even the green space, even an arboretum, even a playground, even all of those things. And even the idea of temporary food trucks in the parking lot, all of which are things we contemplated and talked about. Because as I read the text of this, all of that requires us to go through our own process to the Planning Commission, to ourselves, with public hearings. I don't understand where our plan is for how even something as simple as, like I mentioned, I mean, next summer we want to have a farmer's market or food trucks. Do we understand how to get there through our own process? And that may not be a topic for today's discussion, but it remains my biggest concern with how we use this for our community uses. I like that other people have to use our process because I think the process is very thorough. I agree, it's not out of the ordinary standard for the what the expectation for developers would be, but it seems complicated to put ourselves through that. So I'd like for us to sort of continue the conversation, whether it's in Parks and Building or land development or in a work session, about how we get there, how we move forward with that piece in parallel to whatever the sort of third-party development component may be, because frankly, that part may be years away still from happening. The other thing I've registered concern about before is losing the kind of continuity of the 50% rule that we have in our other zoning districts. I do think that you know, I fully support any and all of Scott's ideas about how we embed whatever MKSK's, you know, with fine tuning. I was the first to register. I think both the connectivity and the community uses of that. But once we get that in whatever final form it is, I think having that be a very clear to everybody in the development community, clear to ourselves, clear to whoever, as part of, you know, like, we've worked hard to make sure that we want to, you know, that this is part of what we expect. And the fact that it is close to 50% does help allay some of that. And there are still setback requirements and things, I think, embedded in this. So I think, you know, from a pure 133 divided by 2 standpoint, the likelihood that you're going to have pavement and buildings on, you know, 50% is very low based on where we are right now. So that has allayed some of my concerns with that. But conditional upon adopting some or all of Scott's, and I don't have a preference really. I sort of defer to recommendations and the group consensus on the best way to sort of incorporate this. I think all of them sound great to me. And you know, that is consistent with Tom's language at the beginning, which I know we worked on to make sure that this is supposed to be passed with a sentiment of council that we fully expect there to be, you know, community pieces here. So my only concern with it, and again, is expressing that, is and maybe this goes to your point, Ed, and to some extent, Peg, where you were saying like that we got to get to the like, how do we do it? How do we move forward with the community, you know, with a community space or green space or conservation space? It's great to set it aside. It's great to have nature. That's critical. But if we want to fix the cart paths, if we want to build a playground, if we want to just have a parking lot to have, or somewhere to have the ice cream social someday, or a temporary event, an event that is temporary, which we allow for, how do we get there? I'm not clear and I'm concerned. So it's not for today's meeting, but I'm registering that complaint and concern.
Okay, what I wrote down was your example of how would we, Amberley, if we want to, how would we gain approval if this was in place 9 months from now? And using your example, somebody wanted to have, you know, food truck or something. So I actually separated it into two different kind of examples that you could work through. One would be what I would call a temporary use, kind of like a food truck or, you know, a farmer's market or something like that. And then one would be more permanent. You know, if we got a donation that would fund a playground or something like that, or a series of donations, what would be the process Amberley would go through?
Right.
And then the other thing I wrote down was the whole discussion of community space that was kind of begun in the public buildings and parks. Does that kind of summarize it?
I think that's right. And then just the third thing is just reiterating that, you know, this is still our community property. And so having a public process around development and general economic development as well is, you know, I think still critical, remains absolutely critical. And I think speaks to Ed's point as well, frankly.
Okay. And then I have kind of three things, and one is kind of the same as Peg. When I read through the Planning Commission's comments on retail and so forth, yeah, I do recall us working through this in our work sessions, but I'm still kind of uncomfortable from the standpoint of, you know, if 2 years from now, you know, post-pandemic and everything, someone comes up with a great idea that they would like to put a restaurant, you know, that people could go up and do something, but they want to do it standalone. I just want to understand that a little bit more and talk through that. Then the other thing I've thought a lot about in reading through the comments, and I've thought about it, not just reading through the comments over the last few days, but I kind of asked myself, why now? And can we delay this thing? And then I kind of started thinking about this, and it kind of ties into what Scott talked about. You know, the property is zoned Residence A. It's not just single family residence. It is Residence A, which is basically exactly what the residents said to the country club back more than 15 years ago that they didn't want. And so I kind of sat here and said, all right, if it's currently zoned what exactly the residents said they didn't want, well then, you know, that answered my question, why now? We've owned the property for more than 10 years and we've been sitting on it and it's zoned wrong. And so it's incumbent upon us to try to get it to be zoned more appropriately. And I think the direction we've gone with the zoning text, which just creates a list of uses, you know, 80% of which are never going to happen. It's only, you know, we've got a list of things that could happen, but only 20% of them, I don't know which 20% it's going to be, but, you know, 15 years from now, it's only 20% of them that's going to happen. And I think we've spent a lot of time coming up with those list of uses. They're consistent with what, you know, our residents have said they would consider on the property. It's not saying that it is going to be on the property. It's just, you know, if that makes sense. So I feel a lot better about, you know, why now. And the other reason I feel good about why now, I mentioned in our last public session that over the last 9 years as a council member, I've had, I don't know how many discussions I've had with people in the development industry. And, you know, they almost to a person, they say that, you know, if a property is not zoned somewhat correct, they're not interested in even looking at it because they know zoning takes a long time. So, you know, the idea of waiting to do zoning until we have an idea of, you know, from somebody about what they want to do on the property, I just don't think makes any sense whatsoever based on what I've heard. And then the final thing I wanted to say, and it kind of ties into what you just said, Alita, you know, I think this, I would feel very different about some of this if we did not control the property. And I come back to, we control the property. And I feel real good about the process that we've started to get laid out because we're getting the zoning, I think, right. But that's just the beginning of the process. The public dialogue about, you know, down the road, we get a proposal, the opportunity for public dialogue about what exactly we're going to be doing on the property, the way we're laying it out with the zoning text, I think allows a tremendous amount of public dialogue, input, and so forth. And then it moves from kind of the theoretical, you know, what is this zoning stuff, to something more, hey, now I can see what it is. And I think that's when you're going to get the best contribution. So, you know, I think we have a few things that we might want to talk about getting, you know, fixing a little bit better in the zoning text, but I feel really good about what we've done. Ray.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to echo some of the thoughts that shared by Peg and Tom. I think and Lita, I think the process has been remarkably open and transparent. This has not been a rushed process, evidenced by all the opportunities for the public to have input, and we've had some input. You know, maybe I wish perhaps maybe we had more public input, but Alita, as you shared, you know, this is not the most sexy issue at this point in time. No one's come to us with a bona fide proposal. I mean, the J had something for a while, but they kind of pulled out for the moment. But I'd like to add that I think I do agree with Tom that the time to do this rezoning, we should have done it a long time ago, frankly, because if we ever wanted to do anything on the property, it would have to be rezoned. Now, of course, if you don't do anything on the property, you just keep it as is. But even there are restrictions because it's Residence A. So I think the time to introduce change is certainly now. If not, it should have been done. It should have been done, you know, years ago. So I'm in favor of moving forward, and as others have said, this is really a first step. This is not the last step. This is really just a first step in what will be probably a long process, simply because we own the property. And if anyone wants to do anything on this property, it's going to have to go through council and you know, how many iterations and public meetings. So this is really just the first step, but it's an important first step because it enables us to do things, whereas before we couldn't do anything. So I'm certainly very pleased. I'm certainly, hats off to Scott and his staff for really putting together multiple packages to inform the residents as well as us in terms of what's going on. Certainly thanking Brian Snyder for helping us walk through this and educating us in this process. Certainly I'm not an expert. I hope we do have an opportunity to visit this 20% retail space limitation that we put in. I think I think I remember why we kept it at 20%, because we didn't want like a Kmart on the property. And so by having it linked to something else, it would prevent something like that happening. But maybe we can think a little bit more broadly than what we currently have. So that's really what I have to share. Thanks again for everyone's contributions.
Okay. Natalie.
Thanks. My notes look like scribbles. So first of all, I am very comfortable with the process so far that we have undertaken. I am more than comfortable with the amount and variety of communication that has been disseminated to our residents, including the opportunity, multiple opportunities for residents to communicate back with us, either by Zoom or in person or email over the past year. As Peg said earlier, our residents are very well informed and not afraid to speak their mind, particularly if they don't like something. And, you know, last week we had one meeting on a dog park. Oh my God, I didn't call it a dog park. It's not a dog park. It is not a dog park. One meeting on Amberley Green, and the subject was dogs. And if it was a real room, the room was full. People wanted to talk about the dogs, and they didn't need several months of public hearings and invitations to speak, et cetera, reply online. I mean, they knew where to go, and our residents, I do not, underestimate them at all. They know how to convey their opinion to us. So I think our residents are happy with what we're discussing. They, for the most part, except for, the few that we hear from regularly. I want to also comment on, regarding the current zoning, the current Residence A zoning. Last week, I believe it was last Monday, in one day, in 3 different times of the day, 3 different sources, I think it was podcast and maybe 2 articles regarding the current real estate market because of the pandemic. We are experiencing a housing boom and low interest rates at the exact same time because the pandemic has shown people that it's nice to have a big house or a house to live in when you can't go anywhere else. So I think that a tract of land zoned single family home on 1-acre lots could be looking more and more attractive to developers. And that is the one thing we know for sure our residents have told us they don't want. So it really is time for us to responsibly work on rezoning the property. The other thing, a master plan has been mentioned, and I have stated that from my point of view, we have as much of a master plan as we need on that property because I think it is beneficial to have unspecified ideas of what can go in large tracts of one property. This is not an entire town we're talking about developing. It is one parcel within our village, and all of the master plan communications that have been forwarded to us were regarding entire villages, township, city, but not a parcel of land. And then finally, I definitely agree with all who have said that the MKSK slope study, and I did not say this at the public parks, but I agree that the CT connectivity study, both of those should either be appended or incorporated. I favor just appending the documents because they give a fuller picture of how we view the property and what we would like to see on the property, and frankly, what we would be willing to approve in terms of development of the property. Those documents identify our values. So I would file those along with whatever we end up doing with the zoning. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. I learned a lot through the whole process.
Okay. So here's kind of what I think I can, or my proposal of how we work this. With with respect to the MKSK study, the issue that Alita brought up about, the process Amberley itself would go through to get, if this zoning was in place, how they would get approval for something temporary or permanent. I think that's going to be hard to work in a session like this. But I would propose, since the Public Buildings and Parks kind of has some other work to do on the MKSK study, and Peg, please, as the chair of that committee, please push back if.
No, we'd be glad to take it up. Could we ask
Well,
Scott
Natalie-
right now, though?
Natalie, you have your hand up.
I just had a question. Yeah, in that respect, it seems to me that if we as a village want to do so much as put up a fence that does not comply with our zoning code, we have to get a variance. Am I wrong? That the village is always subject to whatever the zoning is.
That is definitely correct. And in fact, the example that comes to mind is when we put the fence up for the community garden up at Amberley Green, we actually had to get a variance for that fence.
So that's not the example, though. I mean, obviously that was not what I'm talking about is if the process requires you to submit drawings and plans and specifications and all kinds of detailed stuff to Planning Commission, then to council. I mean, it's a very cumbersome process for getting a permit to have a food truck in the parking lot in a month. It's not feasible, really, because of the timing. And for something that's more, hey, we want to make sure this area is generally, park area. We may not want to spend thousands of dollars to go to MKSK to run a process to just say we want grass and trees and a picnic bench and, maybe some and the picnic bench is going to be literally on this spot and go through a whole, it's very cumbersome process for some of the uses that we're talking about. Obviously, if we're talking about building a building or putting in a permanent structure like a park, like a playground, a dog run, a school, whatever, a solar farm, an agricultural area, any of those things, obviously different. But if we're talking about some picnic tables or, temporary.
Or even just moving the current well, I guess the community garden could stay
The garden,
as it
no, but the
is.
garden's is another good example. So I don't know how formal, I mean, if you read it, it's pretty formal what is required with very specific specificity that has to be presented to Planning Commission and then to council through a very significant process. And I don't object necessarily to that process. I mean, and frankly, we can do it if we have a plan for it, but I think definitely with respect to temporary uses, permitting in a quick event that we want to encourage, that we finally will have zoning to do, especially if there's an opportunity once, the Public Parks and Buildings Committee can discuss whether there should be fees associated with that, which we could charge. And, if you want to have something, you have to pay for that privilege of using our parking lot for something. All of that could be on the table with this. And I just don't know that we have the pathway there. And I agree, Tom, it's not necessarily doesn't have to be for today, but I have always been concerned about the fact that we're might be digging ourselves a little bit of a hole.
And Scott has brought up in the screen sharing what is in the current zoning text with respect to temporary uses. And so, what I would propose is that the public buildings and parks can work through this. And this might be one area that we need to maybe amend the zoning text to incorporate, temporary uses to make it easier or something. But we just need to, we can work through that in that public buildings and parks. And then, if it makes sense to change, then we'll change it.
That's fine. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good place to do it because there may be all kinds of things that events, whether ours or not, that we should be moving into talking about once we can do it. Similarly to the fact that developers are going to get ideas, somebody who wants to rent the property for something else commercial may get ideas too once we get through this.
And also the public buildings and parks was already talking about how you incorporate this into the zoning text, whether that be, as Natalie said, appending it to the zoning text, or whether it needs to be referred. That to me is one of the areas we need to work through to get before we finalize the zoning text.
Well, the committee really endorsed that. I think we thought that we were sending it to council for working out the details. Scott, is that not correct?
Yes, but I think what I'm hearing is that there are areas within the zoning code text that you're going to want to apply that MKSK study to. So I think it makes sense for it to come back to the committee.
Great.
So that we can resolve these issues specifically. And Brian can give us some background on as to how we got to this point, because I think the one thing that we were sensitive to was to make sure that whatever we put in the zoning text, it applied to us. But I also hear that we don't want it to be so cumbersome that it makes it difficult for us to use our own property. And so I think that's where we need to take the practical aspect of it with the zoning law piece of it and work through that with the committee. So I agree that should go back to that particular committee. And then by the same token, in regards to what to do with the study itself, whether to append that or whether to adopt it in another form. So I think that would be a good place to have those types of discussions.
And Scott, just one more, thought for you in that I think it would be helpful and I'm not on that committee, but, to understand what are we talking about as a process if we did, want to draw out a couple of acres of what something looked like, who would you hire? How much would that cost us? What does that mean to put aside something like that? And then potentially also, and again, I'll defer to Peg and you in the committee, but if we were to think about commercial uses, like temporary commercial uses, what other communities might do in terms of fees and things like that for permits and fees and things for that. I mean, I know that's a lot very quickly and it's not the subject of this, but those are the kinds of questions that are on my mind as we get down the line and down the road on this. We have time to do, but again, I think everybody understands the issue, and I really, Mayor, I appreciate your highlighting this and listening to this, because like I said, this has been my thing that has kept me up at night with this. So thank you.
And Ray, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do. I will lower it now. So actually, with regard to temporary uses, speaking to Alita's point, let's say a food truck, let's say with our annual event at Village Hall, we'll have food trucks. And I'm just curious, so what's the process for that approval? Scott?
You mean when we had them for the 75th anniversary?
Well, the 75th anniversary or the ice cream social and, things like that. Because that's on village property. So it has to go through you, right? And so there's already, so we already have what I'm thinking is that we already have a process in place for things on village property, for events on village property. And so can we simply transfer that type of wording or whatever process we have in place to this?
That's a good point. We'll look at what we use here and see if that's applicable to Amberley Green. See if that can be useful in some way. Good point.
The other example is,
If I could say something, Scott.
Yeah.
A couple of things to mention about these points. What Ray just brought up was actually very, very appropriate, because the property, all of the Amberley Green property, is currently zoned A, and it won't be zoned AGD unless somebody asks for that zone change. So 10 years from now, if the village still owns the property and has never developed it, it's still zoned A. So whatever process you're using right now for village-owned property to have events would keep applying until the property was ever rezoned, which could never happen if the village didn't want it to. If the village wanted to keep a part of the property for a park and went through the processes that are in place for parks in the A district, there would never be a need to rezone it to AGD. I think what the AGD district allows is if somebody wanted to, as part of their development, give the town or the village a park, or help with the construction of a park or providing the land for a park, then they could include it in their development plan and go through the process. And that would be, at that point, then it would be rezoned to AGD and all of these uses would be permitted and it could be approved as part of the concept plan. But if that never happens, the property would still be zoned A. And then just real briefly on the second point, any of the studies and plans that are being discussed, to include them as an appendix to this document. This document is not a standalone document. This is a document that's intended to be included in the actual zoning resolution. So you would be talking about making these studies appendices to the actual zoning code. And then including them as text to the zoning code makes it extremely difficult to change them in the future. Whereas if they were plans that were adopted by the village and there was some text that was added to the conditions of approval section of the AGD district, where it allows for traffic studies and other things to be considered as part of the approval process, any adopted plans could be added there either by name or simply by saying one of the criteria is consistency with any plan adopted by village council. So you could spell them out very specifically with the slope study, with the MKSK study. You could define it any way you wanted to, or you could simply leave it generic. And if it has that, it allows you to consider the plan. It doesn't require you to be consistent with it, but it does require you to consider it. And if you feel like it's not consistent with the plan, because it's listed as one of the conditions of approval that you're required to consider, you can use that as a reason to deny the request if somebody in the future wanted to build on some part of the property that was intended to be maintained as open space. So that's just, those are 2 points that I wanted to make. Thank you.
okay, then the other item, that the 20% allowance for retail.
Can we just talk about this for 1 second? Because we have a couple, just on that point, one more thing.
Which point?
Just about what Brian just said. I think Brian just said something so critical about the fact is, like, on day one, we can't go and put up a shelter. We can't go and have those events. But,
If it's a temporary thing, you could.
On an A zone, because I think it's just a good reminder, and it's hard to conceptualize this, right? It's still A zone. On day one, everything is still zoned A, unless we do something, unless it goes through some process. So even, yeah. So, and I don't think we have necessarily a concurrence on adopting that plan for a set aside of green space is not the same thing as saying, okay, we intend all that area to be set aside. That would have to go through a whole process, which we would presumably, if we were going to do that, we'd go through a whole planning process, we'd go through the whole process. But for smaller things, it's like, it's challenging. What do we do? Rezone an eighth, like a corner so that we can put a bench on a corner. Those are the things that I think, again, the Parks Committee can work that out. But I think Brian's frame was critical and I had forgotten why this is such a strain on my brain, which is, there would have to be pretty good consensus among, and a real plan and a real process if we're going to say, okay, we want to set aside 5 acres to zone it for park, to do some stuff on it and have a pretty well vetted plan out to do that. And, even like redoing the cart paths, I can imagine some of these things are gonna, it's challenging. There's a lot of things to think through, but remembering that it doesn't automatically happen on day one, just with a rezoning is critical. So thank you, Brian, for bringing that up.
No problem.
Natalie, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I do. Well, I wanted to thank Brian for his clarifying what we should do with these other plans, the MKSK and the CT study connectivity plan, because we definitely want to handle them in the correct way. So, now I'm rethinking whether it should be appended and whether it needs to be, and I don't want to, I wouldn't want to screw things up by doing the wrong thing. And yeah, no, I don't have any, that's it.
Okay, then on the 20% retail allowance, that's the other item that I think what I'm hearing from earlier comments, that we need to figure out a way to work as to whether we want to consider any other options or anything like that. And again, I think it's going to be difficult to look at, my preference would be a committee to work that, because I think it's easier to work that in a committee environment. And for me, we could either assign that to the law committee or the land use committee.
I prefer the land use.
I prefer land use.
Do we really need to send it back to committee? We had a discussion here. Can't we just be refreshed on what Brian was here, Scott was here. Do we really want to revisit it to that extent?
Well, the Planning Commission basically said, in their opinion, we should get rid of the 20%.
Let me suggest this. Why don't we have a brief discussion here with Brian about how that came to be, to help refresh all of us on where we landed and why we landed on this retail restriction.
Okay, no problem. So the original discussion about the uses on the Amberley Green were that there were to be no retail uses at all of any kind, no restaurants, no retail, nothing like that, that it was mostly limited to your public buildings, nonprofit institutions, and offices. And so when you have offices, you oftentimes will have a store or something like that in the lobby of the office, or some portion of the building. We were thinking, because medical office was included, like gift shops, or like a flower store or a coffee shop, something like that, that is related to the office use of the office building that's being built. And the way that you ensure that it doesn't end up being, like the whole building is retail, is you put a percentage in there. A typical percentage for a small office, or for a larger office building to have a small retail component, is 20%. That's not very big as it goes to all offices, and it limits the ability to have, for offices to have some retail, but not too much. And so that's where the 20% came from. Then we've talked about adding restaurants. We went through a discussion about whether retail in general was acceptable, and I think everybody agreed that that was not. But restaurants were, without drive-throughs, were added as a permitted use. So leaving the retail restriction in here would require that it be part of some kind of a multi-use building still, and would still prevent any standalone restaurants, or like a mixed-use building where the whole first floor is restaurant and the second floor is residential or office, or something like that. So the reason that 20% is in there was because the idea was that it was going to be part of an office development and not be standalone. That was the the reasoning for that percentage.
And Brian, if somebody wanted, say, 40% of the building to be retail, they could get a variance for that, correct?
They could. It's a number and it's in the resolution, right? And the retail is not it's a permitted use at a certain percentage. So I don't know. I wouldn't consider it to be a use variance, other than the fact that it's intended to be, part of a mixed use development. So if they were to ask for, greater than 50%, then the majority of it would be retail, and then it would be the primary use of the property would be retail, as opposed to the secondary use that it's intended to be.
Good question. Are you allowed in these things to restrict by like total square footage or something, or is that not really appropriate? It's
generally not appropriate unless you have like done a study and there's a reason for the percentage. What I always go back to is people have often tried to eliminate fast food restaurants by saying the minimum square footage of a restaurant use is 2,000, or whatever is just bigger than the biggest fast food restaurant. I want to say that I've heard that that's gone down in other places, have been upheld in places because it's not a use restriction, but the fast food industry is going to argue that it is because it eliminates their ability to have one there, where other types of restaurants are permitted. So it's not clear that it's illegal to use square foot area as the basis. It's just it's problematic.
So I think where this puts us is, what is it you're trying to achieve with the property? And if you want more retail on the property, then the percent can be modified. It's your zoning text. But if you're trying to maintain what Brian just described, which is what he gleaned from our discussions, then we probably ought to leave it alone. Or the third option would be to refer it to a committee for further discussion.
I just confirmed, did I hear you say that we added restaurants in as a permitted use separate from retail? Is that what you just said?
Yes.
Okay.
Restaurants without drive.
Restaurants without drive-throughs. Okay, I think that was sort of a compromise amongst ourselves around concerns about retail, desire to have possibly have a restaurant. As I recall, the discussions with the developers in the general way, retail was considered like not likely, not going to be successful. It's not the right setting for it. So I guess that allays, I'm one of the ones that put that on the agenda. That allays my concerns. I'm comfortable leaving it as is.
Any consensus on that, or?
I'm good. This is a good refresher for me.
Okay, so maybe we can check that one off the list. Tom, are you okay?
Yeah, I need to think about it some more, but for right now, yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. All right.
So do we have a way forward?
Well,
we're not doing business tonight, right?
Committee.
No, I mean, the way forward is through, the next step will be to work with the public buildings and parks.
Right.
Is that likely to happen before our next council meeting, or probably likely after our next council meeting?
Not likely before the December meeting.
Oh.
That's only in 2 weeks with 4 committee meetings for the budget. But possibly before the January meeting, Scott?
Yes, yeah.
That's the 11th.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Anyone traveling for COVID? Bad joke.
Other comments?
I just wanted to add one quick thing to Ray, kind of between Ray and Ed and just all the synthesis of everybody's comments. I think just really clarifies again that this is a zoning plan, and just reiterating that that's not a plan. I want to take that back. A zoning framework.
Yes.
It is not a development plan. It's not a map to what we want. And, you know, again, I've expressed concern about what we end up telegraphing to the development community. I mean, obviously Scott is still going to work economic development the same way that we always have. And that piece is still trying to find the best fit. And there is no race to get the whole thing done ASAP. There may be portions of this property that are our savings account for 50 years, or, you know, don't make sense that if things will evolve, or, you know, whatever that is. And I think just reminding ourselves and our community and anybody watching, you know, that the fact that we don't have a map of where every single building is going to go here is, if we had done it 10 years ago, we'd be looking at something different now based on changing needs and things. And, you know, I'm eager to take it slow and get it right and have a lot of community input, as you heard me say a million times, but I think it was just really a good refresher and reminder to have everybody's framework today about what we are doing and what we're not doing. And I'm just, again, very appreciative for the conversation that will happen in parks and buildings, because I think we have this opportunity to start really dreaming about our part, the part that we play on this, which is just as much a part as, you know, the economic development piece. So it's exciting to be in that position.
Can I add one thing too? Longer term, not this meeting, but in relation to this, I think we need to consider creating some norms and procedures for council members relative to development of village-owned property. Should at some point this property become very high profile, council members may be, you know, asked to meet with developers, and that has not been our process, and it's not been an issue to this point. But I think we must not assume, you know, we're not always going to have Scott as our village manager, that things, you know, turn over, people are less sophisticated, less experienced. So I just think that's something we should keep on our docket, maybe sometime next year.
That's a good idea.
Good point.
Okay, anybody have anything else? Scott?
I'm good. It's been very productive.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And
Are we soliciting any comments from?
no,
residents?
this is a council meeting, not a committee meeting, and consistent with council meetings, that is not something you do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we can consider the meeting adjourned. Thank you very much. Everybody have a nice evening.
Thank you.